The Ottoman Empire, a multi-ethnic state, was undoubtedly one of the most powerful in human history. It was founded in the 13th century and continued to exist for hundreds of years. At its peak, it controlled almost the entire Mediterranean Sea, and it even defeated another historical empire, the Roman Empire, in 1453. Within it, dozens of different peoples coexisted, each with their own culture and religion. But they were all dominated by the Turks, and they did not let anyone challenge their authority. By the 1910s, the splendor of this power had already passed, and the empire was in sharp decline. As tensions began to rise in Europe and Asia, many began to anticipate that it would not take long for this once power to fall. But its rulers, blinded by past glory, did not want to see the end of their hegemony. They would be capable of any kind of atrocities to continue maintaining their power. That is why today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you what the First World War was like from the point of view of the Ottoman Empire. To begin this story, let's first take a look at the situation of the country that now bears the name of Turkey, prior to the outbreak of the conflict. By the beginning of the 20th century, the nation was in a state of serious decline. It was plagued by political and social problems, carried out mostly by the minorities who lived there, who sought their independence. Along with the Ottomans, there were Arabs, Armenians, Jews, Greeks, Kurds, and Balkan peoples, among many others. This great ethnic diversity was also reflected in the religions professed. The dominant belief was Islam, but there were many others, such as Christianity, which was also one of the most important. Although the government tolerated the coexistence of all creeds, in recent years, when the empire began its decline, a certain tension began to form between them, mainly with the Armenian Christians. Muslims felt that these groups perceived too much favoritism from the ruling authorities, while minorities felt persecuted. Many of them resented the repressive doctrines of the ruling Turks. Everyone could see that the empire was no longer as powerful as it had been. Taking advantage of this situation, a movement of officers and politicians called the Young Turks took over the government. With many members within the military, they did not meet with much resistance and were able to depose the reigning sultan and put another in his place. But this figure was purely symbolic. Control of the nation was actually wielded by Enver Pasha, supreme commander of the armed forces. A progressive in character, he reinstated parliament, suspended since 1878. After a vote, the first in many decades, his party became the elected ruler. Despite this breath of fresh air, Pasha was unable to recover the Ottoman Empire from its inevitable decline. Other powers in Europe had already sensed his weakness, and they began to tear him apart. The first of his lost territories was Bosnia and Herzegovina, annexed by Austria-Hungary in 1908, shortly after the Young Turk Revolution. In 1911, Italy took Libya and Africa and some islands in the Aegean Sea in a short but bloody war. Only a year later, the Balkan League, made up of Serbia, Bulgaria, Montenegro, and Greece, expelled Turkey from its last territorial possessions in Europe. All these defeats made Pasha and his party begin to lose their progressive nature and start to take on nationalist ideas. They had begun their mandate with great popular support, since many thought that the empire would be dissolved and the minorities would achieve their independence. But now, the Young Turks maintained that the weakness shown in the lost wars was due to the disunity between their peoples. Therefore, the Ottoman Empire had to be maintained if it was to survive.
Although they may not have intended it that way, they found themselves fighting to maintain and perpetuate empire from 1911 onwards, from Italy's invasion of Tripoli onwards. Then came the Balkan Wars, and then there came the Great War. And this changed them. This transformed their initial attitude of promising and bringing freedom to the Ottoman peoples into one of maintaining empire.
During these conflicts, one power that had shown its friendship with the Ottomans was Germany. In addition to providing economic assistance, they also sent military officers to train soldiers for their army. The Germans' interest was due to the fact that, by the beginning of the 1910s, the beginning of a new war could already be predicted. Alliances were being formed between the European powers, among which the United Kingdom, France, and Russia stood out. Germany decided to look for its own partners and saw in the Ottomans a good candidate. The Turks were not in a position to refuse help, no matter who it came from. The fighting had almost completely exhausted their resources. This pact between the two nations was kept secret, as there was fear of reprisals from the other powers. Mostly Russia, which was the main rival of the Ottoman Empire, and France, which was allied with the Tsar. Even within Turkey, there were detractors. The Sultan argued that the relationship with Germany would bring war to the weakened empire and end up dissolving it. But the real authority, General Enver Pasha, was decidedly pro-German. This was the ominous situation when, on June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was assassinated in Sarajevo. The victim's compatriots blamed Serbia for the assassination. This murder marked the beginning of the Great War. All the imperial alliances agreed upon in the previous years came into play. The United Kingdom, Belgium, France, Russia quickly joined the Serbian side. Germany, for its part, joined the Austro-Hungarians. Although they had signed a secret pact with the Germans, the Ottoman Empire remained on the sidelines during the first months of the conflict, but it would soon be dragged into it by one of its leaders. On October 29th, Enver Pasha ordered Turkish ships to attack Russian ports on the Black Sea without consulting many of his colleagues. The offensive was a surprise and resulted in nearly 20 Tsarist ships being sunk. Immediately afterwards, the Russian Empire declared war on the Ottoman Empire. France and the United Kingdom followed suit a few days later. The young Turks had fulfilled their mission of entering the conflict, seeking to revitalize their dying nation. Together with Germany and Austria-Hungary, they formed the faction of the Central Powers, which faced the nations of the Allied powers. Despite the numerous declarations of war received, Russia remained the main enemy of the Ottoman Empire. Both wanted to seize regions of territory belonging to their rival. The Tsarists were aware of the discontent of the minorities living in Turkey and did not hesitate to take advantage of it. Nicholas II, the leader of the nation, addressed himself primarily to the Armenians, promising them freedom if they rebelled against their oppressors. Of course, he did not mention that in his country, the minorities were also harshly persecuted. In December 1914, Pasha finally ordered a full-scale attack on his enemy. Around 100,000 men advanced on the Caucasus region in southern Russia. There, mainly in the city of Baku, were concentrated the largest oil reserves in the empire. Seizing them would mean a brutal blow to the Tsar's forces, as it would leave his vehicles and planes without fuel. Almost 30 years later, Adolf Hitler would come to the same conclusions about the importance of this area in his campaign against the Soviet Union. And just as it had happened at that time, the terrible Russian winter destroyed the plans of the would-be conquerors. The Ottoman soldiers were overwhelmingly poor peasants, with no experience in combat. Moreover, their superiors did not spare themselves in providing them with footwear or clothing to face the severe cold. Many died without even being touched by Russian bullets, victims of hypothermia and brutal weather conditions. Several others deserted, knowing that the battle was lost. Those who remained found that their rifles were inoperative due to the sub-zero temperatures. The Russians did not forgive this setback. Amassing their forces, they counterattacked in early January at the Battle of Sarıkamış and quickly forced the Ottomans to retreat. 85% of the Turkish forces perished in the frozen Russian steppes.
In the biting winter, the Turks faced a ferocious Russian counterattack. Of 95,000 Turkish soldiers who fought the campaign, only 18,000 survived. Some 30,000 froze to death.
For Enver Pasha, it was a severe humiliation. both military and political, and as is often the case in such cases, someone was quickly found to blame for the catastrophe. This terrible weight fell on the Armenian people. In addition to the religious differences already explained, many people belonging to this group had joined the Russian forces as volunteers, wanting to escape persecution in Turkey. The Ottoman government exaggerated the importance of these units in the lost battle, and also pointed to the nearly 2 million Armenians living in the country as saboteurs and spies. While it is true that there were minor uprisings in certain cities, the majority of civilians never took up arms against the authorities. Enver Pasha and his collaborators did not care. They launched measures in which leaders of establishments were allowed to expel from their homes anyone seen as a threat to Ottoman security. Another law authorized the confiscation of the property of the exiles, since they were considered abandoned. On April 24, 1915, the Turkish authorities began the mass arrest of Armenian leaders and intellectuals. Those serving in the army were transferred to forced labor units, where they suffered terrible abuse and torture. Many of them died due to these brutal conditions. Approximately 1.2 million Armenians were sent to prisons, then deported from the country, in what became known as the Armenian Genocide. They were forced to march through the Syrian desert with almost no food or water, and were victims of the constant sadism of the Turkish soldiers who escorted them. Thousands died from hunger, thirst, heat, or from being beaten and shot by their jailers. However, their suffering did not end when they reached their destination. In the middle of the desert, they were placed in concentration camps, where conditions were not much better than during those death marches. Here, was very common, and often ended in the death of women. Any man who dared to raise his voice against the guards was also quickly killed. Many of the children who had survived the ordeal were taken from their families and given to families of Turkish origin, where they were taught to reject Christianity and adopt Islam as their religion. The goal was the total elimination of the Armenian people. It is estimated that between 600,000 and 1.5 million people were killed due to the actions of the Ottoman Empire.
En Türkiye Horaspani Manating yes meres erguachte Spanumein Parnumein Fuzargumein Amotse Parnaparumein Men nicht tesilin Men Savamain Etmen Kating Musum Haten Chaitalum Lincheng Bobby the big Savat Taramanik.
But while Enver Pasha and his associates vented their frustrations on these innocent people, World War I continued. In Western Europe, fighting had become bogged down in the trenches of France, with neither side able to gain the upper hand. Months passed, soldiers fell by the hundreds of thousands, but the battlefront shifted by only a few miles. Because of this situation, the belligerent countries began to consider the idea of continuing the offensive in another region. It was here that Tsar Nicholas II turned to his allies, asking for help against the Ottoman offensive. The British and French, eager to expand their influence into the Mediterranean Sea, readily agreed. Their objective would be to seize the Dardanelles Strait, which connects the Aegean and Marmara Seas. If they took it, they could attack Turkey from the north, a region that was less well defended. One of the main organizers of this campaign was Winston Churchill, who at that time held the role of First Lord of the Admiralty, which made him responsible for the Navy. Although he did not yet have much military experience, he was able to convince his superiors of the British chances of success if the operation was launched. He considered the Ottoman Empire to be the enemy's weak flank and thought that if attacked, it would quickly fall. At the beginning of 1915, the offensive began. 18 ships of the Anglo-French fleet attacked the coast of the Gallipoli Peninsula, located in the Dardanelles. Immediately, the Allies realized that they had underestimated the defensive capacity of their enemies. 3 ships fell due to Turkish guns, and 3 others were severely damaged. Although this attack failed, the British continued with their plans for the landing. a coalition of English, French, Australian, and New Zealand soldiers was prepared for this purpose, but they no longer had the element of surprise. The Ottomans, along with some German officers, were waiting for them. On April 25th, the Allies attempted to invade 5 beaches at Gallipoli at once. They were met with intense artillery fire, while machine gun fire, a new type of weapon, mopped up the few who could put their boots on the sand. Despite thousands of dead, some troops were able to push deep enough to set up positions on the coast. However, after seeing the tenacity of the Turks, the Allies became overly cautious. They failed to take advantage of the momentum of the landing, and their offensive stalled. As was happening in Europe, the battlefront in the Mediterranean became a war of trenches and attrition. The arid climate meant that men died as much from heat and disease as from bullets and artillery. The Ottomans also suffered heavy casualties, but continued to fight to defend their country. Although the British were able to land reinforcements, they were unable to overwhelm the locals. Finally, in late 1915, the idea of evacuation was considered. Churchill, of course, was fervently opposed, as it would mean terrible humiliation. However, the Allied situation at Gallipoli was untenable. Approximately 50,000 soldiers had died so far in the campaign, and no favorable results had been achieved. The Ottoman Empire was no closer to collapse than before the British ships deployed their men. Defeated, Churchill had to accept that his battered forces began to withdraw from the peninsula in January 1916. Although the Turks celebrated this outcome, they had not emerged unscathed from the battle either. The defense of the peninsula proved extremely costly, with more than 80,000 dead and tens of thousands wounded. And although they had a period of peace due to the successful expulsion of the attackers, their joys would quickly be soured by an old enemy. Gallipoli had not been the only arena where the Allies sought to strike at the Ottoman Empire. The English and French knew of the resentment of the oppressed peoples towards the Turks, so they sought to take advantage of that. Mostly, they focused on the Arabs, who had been under the imperial yoke for almost 4 centuries. Now their main tormentor was Cemal Pasha, another of the empire's military and political leaders. Like the Armenians, the Arabs were also constantly persecuted, while their religious and intellectual leaders were arrested or even killed to prevent popular uprisings. It was not uncommon for Ottoman officials to enter Arab villages to search for victims, looting, raping, and executing anyone who crossed their path.
مرحلة جمال باشا مرحلة مظلمة في تاريخنا. المجاعة، الشنق، الجواسيس، التجويع، الفساد، التآمر، المشانق مش بس بالساحة المزة وساحة الشهداء ببيروت البرج، أيضا بحيفا كمان بذات الوقت يعني قتلوا الانتليجنسيا العربية.
Knowing that this group sought to establish an independent state, the Europeans promised their help in achieving this if they assisted in the destruction of the Ottomans. Thus it was that in June 1916, numerous attacks were launched against Turkish garrisons in various regions of Arabia. What the external enemies could not achieve was carried out by an internal rival. It was on this front that the figure of Thomas Edward Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, became famous. This British officer was indispensable in coordinating the offensives of local guerrillas against Turkish soldiers. Battles between the two sides continued for years, but the Ottomans, weakened by constant fighting, began to lose ground. Finally, on October 1st, 1918, the city of Damascus in Syria fell to the rebels. Thus, the last stronghold of the Imperials ceased to exist, along with their dominance in the region. Having been defeated on all fronts, on the 30th of the same month, Enver Pasha was forced to sign his absolute surrender to the Allied forces. Only a few weeks later, Germany followed suit, ending the First World War. The little territory that the Turks had been able to conquer in the fighting, which corresponded to the Caucasus region, had to be returned to Russia. Nothing was left of its extension in the Arabian Peninsula. But the Arab partisans were not satisfied with the final outcome either. Despite British promises, almost all of Arabia was divided between the United Kingdom and France, without the establishment of an independent state. The Ottoman Empire did not survive for long after the end of the war. With large parts of its territory already conquered by the victors and the weakening of the regime caused by the defeat, the nation, which had been established at the end of the 13th century, ceased to exist. Numerous countries emerged from it, such as Turkey, Armenia, Palestine, Iraq, among many others. Although they were no longer part of the same government, all these nations were united by the blood they shed during these years. Approximately 500,000 Ottoman soldiers died in the fighting of the war, but the civilian numbers are much worse. More than 2 million died due to bullets, missiles, malnutrition, and disease. Many of them, as we saw with the Armenian Genocide, fell victim to the regime that should have protected them. We have reached the end of the video, and we want to ask you, which other country would you like to know its point of view during the First World War? Leave us your answer in the comment box below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more events that left their mark on history.